Section 6. The Self, Internalist or Externalist? Edelman asks a number of very profound questions about the relations between the self, higher-order consciousness, language, and qualia. He says, quote, "Once higher-order consciousness begins to emerge, along with language, a self can be constructed from social and affective relationships. Here we must consider two related issues that are fundamental to the understanding of higher order consciousness. The first has to do with how critically the subjective world depends on language. The second is related to how qualia are affected by higher order consciousness." End quote. Edelman also refers to internalist and externalist positions on the self. Quote, "Views differ strongly about the relation of subjectivity to the development of the self. The two extremes may be called the internalist and externalist positions on the subjective." End quote. Edelman explains that, quote, "According to the internalist view, there is first a subjective experience, say that of a young baby, and then increasing differentiation of the self, with self-consciousness occurring as a result of both social and linguistic interactions. Although there is no direct way to know the nature of the early subjective state, it is considered to be the necessary basis for the subsequent emergence of the true self. In this internalist view, some thinking is ontologically possible before language is acquired. Thus, young children can know and figure out the intentions of their parents even before they have language." End quote. Quote, "But according to the alternative externalist view, it is meaningless to talk about subjective responses or inner states until language is acquired. Language is acquired through interpersonal interactions that are social. When enough language is in place, the conceptual bases of the self emerge. Only when that emergence occurs can one consider that a conscious and above all a self-conscious individual is present. In this view, prior subjectivity is indeterminate, and it is meaningless to ask what it is like to be X, whether X is a pre-linguistic baby or a bat." End quote. Edelman goes for a midway position, quote, "An animal with just primary consciousness that lacks symbolic capabilities has no possibility of developing a notion of a self, of time past, or of time future. But from early times in a baby with linguistic capabilities, cues from the outside are transformed by emotional exchanges with the mother. There is a continuous drive toward language from the earliest times. This does not appear to be the case for the higher apes, such as chimpanzees, even though they appear to have semantic capabilities with some degree of self-differentiation. But unlike humans, such apes do not appear to be compelled toward language. In the case of a baby, higher order consciousness, a self-concept, and a notion of past and future emerge rapidly with language and socialization. While we cannot say when the true subject starts, we can be sure that from birth, the baby is constructing his or her own scenes via primary consciousness, and that these scenes rapidly begin to be accompanied by the refurbishment of concepts through gesture, speech, and language." End quote. Edelman's account of the emergence of the self is heavily weighted to the human cognitive and linguistic end of the mammalian spectrum. He says that the self, quote, leads to a refinement of phenomenological experience, tying feelings to thoughts, to culture, and to beliefs, end quote. If consciousness of consciousness is necessary for the self, then this certainly requires language, quote. Necessarily, higher order consciousness involves social interactions. When full linguistic capability based on syntax appeared in precursors of Homo sapiens, higher order consciousness flowered, partly as a result of exchanges in a community of speakers. Syntactically and semantic systems provided a new means for symbolic construction and a new type of memory mediating higher order consciousness. Consciousness of consciousness became possible, end quote. Edelman uses the example of wine connoisseurs to illustrate how humans can refine certain qualic experiences, and claims that the term describable qualia be limited to human conscious experience, quote. As linguistically communicating persons, we know what it is like to be human. From the standpoint of a person, qualia are higher order categorizations by the self of the conscious experiences of that self that are mediated by the interaction between value category memory and perception. The ability to describe and further elaborate various qualia requires the simultaneous presence of both higher order and primary consciousness, end quote. Having language, humans can also communicate their experiences to each other. As Edelman says, quote, with less danger of false projection than when we attempt to map our experience onto other animals in non-linguistic species, end quote. However, the fact that animals such as cats or bats lack the means to elaborate their phenomenal experience, says Edelman, quote, by no means implies that these animals do not experience pain, for example, end quote. He concludes that although animals, quote, have rich means for qualitative phenomenal experience, they have no self-conscious self explicitly to memorialize and refine that experience, end quote.